Greetings. We're going to talk today about the eco-psychological uses of work with plants and animals. And to get us there, I thought I'd start by reading part of a poem by D.H. Lawrence. This is called Whales Weep Not. They say the sea is cold, but the sea contains the hottest blood of all, and the wildest, the most urgent. All the whales in the wider deeps, hot are they, as they urge on and dive beneath the icebergs. The right whales, the sperm whales, the hammerheads, the killers, there they blow, hot, wild, white breath out of the sea. And they rock through the sensual ageless ages on the depths of the seven seas, and through the salt they reel with drunk delight. And in the tropics tremble they with love, and roll with massive, strong desire like gods. And in fact, in many of the world's mythologies, the gods take the form of animals. The word for that is theriomorphic gods. In fact, the word animal itself in English comes from the Latin word anima, which means soul. In doing ecotherapeutic work we'll start with animals. It's very important, actually with plants too, to keep in mind Howard Kleinbell's schema of the ecological circle, where all of this work is relational and it keeps us in conversation with the natural world. It's not just taking and grabbing healing where we can find it. So in work with animals, for instance, it's very important that the animals like the work and possess a state of agency. And you can tell that too. Animal-assisted therapy is what this is usually called, and there are licenses available and training programs, things like that. And when I've talked to people who make this a vocation, they often will tell me that the animals pick them to do the work, that they stepped up to it themselves. And it's important that that be in place so that we're not simply using animals in an exploitive way. So animal-assisted therapy is the usual term for this, and it can come in different arenas and be done in different ways. How it usually shows up in the public eye on news stories, we've probably all seen these, is where combat vets work with horses. They're in the presence of horses. We've all seen people with therapy dogs and other therapy animals too. And the surface reason for that is to calm down people's anxiety. In the presence of their animal companions, they feel better. But there are so many other benefits to that. And there's a wide array of conditions that are used to treat, including people who have suffered some kind of sexual assault, anxiety disorders, addictions, all kinds of things. So what I want to do is give you some examples of not just that kind of work, but below that what's going on. Because underneath our work with animals, we're also, if we do it conscientiously, we're repairing our relationship psychologically with the natural world. And they help us do that. So when we think of animals as mentors, for instance, and learn from them on that level, and you see this in a lot of indigenous sacred stories, which we refer to as myths, not because they're lies, but because they're lore, they're folklore. And a lot of folk tales and fairy tales too, where somebody needs to learn from the animals. And so there's a Greek myth about Psyche and Cupid, in which the character of Psyche has to be schooled by ants and eagles, and even aspects of the natural world like buildings, towers, and stuff like that. But again and again, these tales show us the benefits of listening to the natural world. And so to give a couple of personal examples, when I taught the ecotherapy certificate at John F. Kennedy University, we would ask people who did a lot of animal-assisted therapy work to bring in animals and have us interact with them and see what that was about. And so one of the animals that came in were rabbits. and we set up a little area for them to be in with us. And at the instruction of the trainer who came in, I was sitting with rabbits at one point, and they were moving around me and getting to know what I was like there with them. And at one point, I hadn't been around rabbits much. I've been around other kinds of animals, but at one point, one of the rabbits, it was sniffing around and moving rapidly. And I wouldn't have known this if it hadn't been pointed out to me, but as it was moving around my foot, it touched my foot with its nose as part of all the action that was going on. And the human that was there with the animals said, "You can pet the rabbit now." And I said, "How do you know?" And she said, "Well, the way the rabbit touched you with its nose just now, you didn't see it because it was moving around so rapidly. But that was the rabbit telling you that it's okay to do that." And then I would petted it. But what interested me about that interaction was there's so much animal language that we don't even know how to decipher, because perhaps it occurs at a more rapid time scale than we're used to. Rabbits can move very quickly, and so its gesture to me was above my speed of comprehension until it was actually pointed out to me by another human being. And so now that, I know how to interpret at least one piece of rabbit behavior. But each species has its own language and its own mannerisms, and because we often don't understand, we make the erroneous assumption that these species are dumb and that they're just solely motivated by instinct and other anthropocentric assumptions that keep the barrier culturally and psychologically between us and our fellow animals, because we're all animals physiologically and somatically, and we share a lot of psychological traits with them too, and I'll get to that a little bit later. So there's a language barrier that happens, but that we can overcome to some extent. So part of the work with animals from an eco-psychological and ecotherapeutic standpoint is learning some shared communication. Now, Netta DeMaio is an acquaintance of mine who is in charge of a wild horse sanctuary called Return to Freedom. And if you're interested in learning about what she does, it's returntofreedom.org. It's a ranch in Lompoc, which is about maybe an hour and a half's drive north of Santa Barbara. When Netta was 6 or so, very young, she was watching TV and she saw horses being hunted because they were running over people's ranches, and the ranchers were angry about that. And that image stuck with Netta. And this is something psychologically that happens to a lot of us who are kind of called out to from the natural world. There's something that sticks like that. And so Netta went on to become an adult and do all kinds of interesting vocational things, but that image of the horses never left her. So her family, fortunately, was in the position of being able to buy some land out in Lompoc, and they now use it as a horse sanctuary. So when horses are rescued out there, they come onto the land and they're treated respectfully by humans and who provide food and shelter and all that. But otherwise, the horses are left to do whatever they want to do. There's enough land that they can run free in the hills. And so they can behave as much as possible like they do in the wild. And so they collect in herds naturally, they look out for each other, and Netta leads small groups of humans up into the hills to meet the horses on their own terms. So if you're in a particular group of humans going up there, the horses may choose to come up that day and they may not. So I've gone up there twice on these tours, and both times I was amazed by the assertiveness and the aliveness of the horses. I've been around horses a lot and have ridden them and trained with them a little bit. I'm not an equestrian, but I've been on the backs of lots of horses, groomed them, taken care of them and all that. And the first time I went on one of those tours, I was looking at how amazingly present the horses were and lively and running around, and I realized abruptly that I had never seen a horse that wasn't depressed. Penned up in little boxes on small ranches and separated from each other. And like humans, horses are naturally gregarious. They like hanging around each other. And so sometimes the conditions that we impose on them are bad for them psychologically, and it's reflected in their passive behavior. So it was amazing to me to see what horses actually look like when they're free. And then, of course, I started thinking in terms of my own species. What does this say about not only how we treat horses, but how we feel in captivity? Confined to offices or in situations where our behavior is limited and we can't do what we want, perhaps by economic circumstances or considerations of class and race. What does that do to our spirit? So lots of questions get opened up when you begin actually interacting with animals on that level. So on one occasion, our little band of humans went up into the hills, and Netta gave us some instruction on horse etiquette, because this is their place, so we need to know how to behave ourselves. So for instance, she said, because we have eyes on the front of our face, horses react to us as predators. So don't stare at them, because it makes them nervous. Don't move suddenly and rapidly toward them. That makes them nervous too. And be conscious of what's going on inside you, because horses pick that up. That's one of the reasons they're so great at animal-assisted therapy. They're very aware of our inner states. And at one point, there was a group of horses on a ridge up above us, and they were watching us. And there was a big stallion on one side, and there was a big mare at the head of the horses. And so Netta was pointing out some of the herd dynamics, and she said in horse society, that mare up there is in charge. And so the way the horse was pointed straight at us, staring directly at us. I had never seen a horse behave like that before. It almost felt threatening, and Netta said, she doesn't know if we're a threat or not, so if we make any moves that they don't like, she will charge us, and the stallion's job will be to drive the rest of the herd to safety. And so at that point, one of the younger horses, maybe in human terms it would be late adolescence, early adulthood, came ambling down the hill slowly, being well watched by the other horses that were up there. Netta said, this one's been selected to come say hi to us and see if we're safe, So that horse came down to us and actually allowed us to pet it and touch it. And when it was apparent that that was okay, then the whole herd came down and interacted with us. So that was our morning's lesson in horse psychology. There's a way in which even horses that have been forced to be penned up in two small spaces, even they retain some of their empathy and sensitivity. And so I'm thinking of a horse named Bella, who I rode for a while when I was learning to ride. And when I was a beginner, I would make the beginner's mistake. When you sit on the back of a really big horse, for one thing, it's a lesson in humility, because they have a mind of their own and they'll do whatever they want. But for another thing, it's when they start riding faster than you want, it's a natural impulse to cling to the horse with your legs. And if your feet are pointed downward to cling tighter, then your heels pop out of the stirrups. And you're supposed to keep your heels down. And so when my feet would come out of the stirrups, Bella would slow down. And I should mention, by the way, that this is a horse that I didn't want to ride her unless I sensed her mood. And there were days when I could tell she didn't want to be ridden. She made that pretty clear, actually. And so I always respected that. And then there were other days when it was obvious that she wanted to be ridden. And so I would groom her and pick her hooves and put the tack on her. And then we would go out for a nice ride, and she liked that. And so anyway, when my heels would slip out of the stirrups, Bella would slow down, and she would turn her head sideways like this so that one eye could look at me. And as soon as I got my feet back in the stirrups, she would speed up again. So I was mentioning to my trainer about that behavior. And I said, that's really great the way you taught Bella how to look out for us. And she laughed and she said, we didn't train her any of that. She likes you because you care about what her mood is, and she can tell that. She's sensitive. All horses are. So that was a lesson also for me in interspecies etiquette as well. Um, there's another species I'll mention too, in terms of learning from the animal, and that would be dolphins. There was a time in my life when I lived in Oxnard in California, and when the weather was nice, I used to go ocean kayaking. And oftentimes I saw pods of dolphins going by the coast. I believe they were bottlenose dolphins, Tursiops truncatus, and I often wished I could be among them, but I never got the opportunity. They never were going by when I was kayaking, and so on the last week that I lived in Oxnard, I went out for one last ocean kayaking, and thought, well, now I'm not going to get my chance out here. And then I heard a sound behind me, and I turned around and didn't see anything. And I think it was a seal following me, because that often happens. Seals are curious about us, and their heads will pop up and they'll look at us. So I was looking back behind me, and when I looked forward, about 24 fins stood straight up out of the water, no more than 12 feet ahead of the bow of my kayak, which was a huge surprise. And so I found myself in the middle of a pod of wild dolphins. So they were going in the other direction, so I turned the kayak and paddled after them. And I thought, well, they're going to just take off, and they can swim so much faster than I can paddle. This is probably the closest I'll ever get to them. But instead, the pod slowed down as I came up to them, and they separated so that I had a space in the middle so that I could go with them. And so as I was paddling as fast as I could, there were dolphins swooping on either side of me. And at one point I wanted to actually touch one of them. And so I paddled the boat a little closer, but they always pulled back. So what this told me was, you can accompany us, but no touch. So I went, okay, that's fine. So for about an hour I got to paddle with them. And many people, when they encounter dolphins, talk about a spiritual experience. And my version of that was that the grace with which they moved through the ocean was absolutely astounding. I wrote a little piece afterward called "If Angels Could Swim," and I didn't go in the direction of thinking of them as advanced beings from another plenum or anything like that. I was just so appreciative of their grace and their friendliness and their sensitivity to who I was and where I was and all that. And it was nice to be able to share that space with them. So they taught me something about how courtesy transcends species. And courtesy is based on perhaps an archetypal sense of fairness, which also transcends species. And in fact, this leads me into another part of working with animals, which is interspecies intelligence. Because we've spent so much time in industrial cultures in particular thinking of ourselves as above other animals or different from other animals, we've missed a lot of what sensitive people have told us throughout time, which is that animals have their own kind of complex consciousness, different from ours, but rich and complicated. And so when a worldview shifts the way our worldview seems to be, moving out of this more mechanical, this big machine worldview where we see everything in mechanical terms, more toward a participatory ecological worldview, this shift in collective perception allows our researchers to see relationships that were not visible before. So as a result of this, the interspecies intelligence research has blossomed recently over say the past several years or so. And so an earlier example of this that occurred back in the 1970s was that there was a researcher who was interested in the dolphin intelligence, It wasn't John Lilly. He did some work on that too, but it was somebody who came after him. I forget their name. And this person had heard accounts that when human beings are drowning, sometimes wild dolphins will come up underneath us and bring us up to the surface. They seem to know that we're primates who breathe like they do. So the researcher isolated a dolphin in a pool, and then he set up a camera, and then he went out to the deepest part of the pool, and he thrashed around like he was drowning. And sure enough, this wild dolphin went under him, brought him to the surface. And he got out of the water and realized that he had left the lens cap on the recorder. So he took the cap off, and he decided to do the same thing over again. So he went out to the center, pretended to be drowning, but this time the dolphin swam up to him, and with her tail flukes, she smacked him on the back and then swam away again. Now, dolphins are compared to us, dolphins are extremely powerful creatures, and they're big, right? Most of them. So that could have been a much harder slap. And in fact, when we irritate dolphins in the wild and they give us a little nudge, they're very careful with us. You know, the dolphin forehead and nose is basically a padded ram. They kill sharks with those. So there's some delicacy in how they treat us when we're in the water with them. And so this researcher later wrote that he had the feeling that he had offended the dolphin in terms of her not only etiquette but ethics, that engaging in that kind of deceptive behavior was a definite no-no. So she gave him a little warning, you know. But that's one of many examples of how interspecies research is opening up our understanding of just how complex our fellow creatures are. And so we know things now like that when humpback whales create a song, it has the information content that's comparable to a symphony, and it's elaborated probably over generations of time as it goes through the ocean and is sung by different groups of humpback whales. We know that crows here in California, they used to grab nuts and they would fly up in the air with them and drop them in the road, and then that would break them open. And so what they do now, because the traffic is so bad these days, is the crows will wait until the light changes, and then they will drop the nut in the intersection while people are walking across it, because they know it's safe to do that. Crows, by the way, are intelligent enough that if you tag them, it's kind of funny to watch this happen on film, because when you tag them, they remember your face, and you'll never get another chance. They'll remember you 5 years later. So sometimes researchers have to wear masks, Halloween masks, so they won't be recognized by the crows when they try to tag them. There's so many examples. There are the apes that Susan Savage Rumbaugh worked with, who learn sign language and communicate how they feel to the researcher in complex ways. We know now that dogs as pets can sense when we have diseases sometimes. There are always stories about, you know, a dog became aware that somebody had cancer and they didn't understand why their dog was behaving so weird, and then it turned out it was that, you know. So there's all kinds of things opening up with this trans-species research that's happening. So much so that Gay Bradshaw, G.A. Bradshaw, who is involved in elephant sanctuaries, has coined the term trans-species psychology. So she's calling for a kind of psychology that includes humans, but is more than humans, because we share psyche with other beings too, and her work revolves around that. Where part of where this came from is when she has worked with elephants who are rescued from circuses, she notices that they suffer from their version of post-traumatic stress disorder, and they need a kind of therapy in order to come back to themselves and behave like elephants do. We also know that elephants, by the way, and other primates as well, they remember the anniversaries of loved ones' deaths, and they'll return there and mourn. And you can tell by how their ears look and their behavior that they're in mourning. Um, all of this is becoming much more obvious now that there's actually room in our psyche for it. So one valuable aspect of all this is that it decreases human hubris and human specialness. And it shows us that we actually are part of a much larger family than we thought, and that we belong here and we're not separate from everybody else. And that is a valuable diminishment of human narcissism. So in animal-assisted therapy work, partnering with our animal friends so that there's some healing and some kind of conversation back and forth between us, that's what that aspect of ecotherapy is about. Probably all of us can think of situations too where we've had beloved pets who told us something about ourselves. And so one thing that might be a useful exercise is to actually sit down and imagine a beloved animal as a mentor and make a list. What did I learn from this animal that was important to my sense of self, to my understanding of the world, to my worldview? What did this animal teach me that I didn't know before? So work with animals. Now we'll go to work with plants. And the branch of ecotherapy that deals with this is called horticultural therapy. It's also referred to as gardening therapy. And it takes many different forms. We know from the research that being out among a diversity of plants is actually better for us on many different psychological and physical levels than simply being around a single species of plants, but even that helps. So even having a single flower, for instance, can do good things for your blood pressure, anxiety levels, self-esteem, and so on. No wonder we're always attracted to flowers and trees and all the rest of it. It's biophilia. It's a natural attraction to the forces of life around us. And so in horticultural therapy, this is applied in a systematic way. So there might be a sensory awareness exercise where you smell a number of different plants and you swim in the memories and the feelings that this brings up for you. And you can see how the natural world evokes that in you. There's also a breathing exercise that Joanna Macy teaches where you sit down or stand near, let's say, a bush or a tree, so that your face is relatively close to the leaves. And you breathe into it naturally. And then when you inhale, you imagine that you're inhaling the oxygen that's generated by the plant, because you are. So you become conscious of the fact that your very breath is dependent on the plant, on the oxygen that the plant is giving you. It's a gift. You think of it that way. And then when you exhale, you imagine, because it's happening, that you are feeding the plant the carbon dioxide that it breathes. And so when you do this for more than a few minutes, it begins to be this rhythmic conversation that you have with whatever plant you're directly in front of. And you start to get a better emotional sense of how involved you are with each other all the time. And then, of course, you can spread that to the entire world that supports all of us by giving us oxygen. So I've sometimes thought that the quality of the air in a given location says something about the quality of our spirituality there, our eco-spirituality, the kind of spirituality that has to do with an experience of the world as sacred. So what does that say about air pollution? Or what does that say about areas that have been regenerated so that the air isn't polluted anymore? So many different forms of horticultural therapy. Eating nutritious food can be part of that. And an exercise to use also is to eat something that's nutritious and that you enjoy, and to eat it slowly, to make yourself really savor every sensation that you can while you're eating it and take your time with it. and in that way be in even closer touch with what nourishes and sustains you. Now, some other implications of horticultural and gardening therapy. So I should mention soil fungi. When you go down about an inch into healthy soil, you might see tiny little weavings, tiny little bundles of fungi, and their fruiting bodies on the surface look like mushrooms. But for the most part, they're invisible. It's an invisible network in the soil. And it stretches a little bit like nerve fibers do in the human body. And so there's a number of things that this mycelium does for us and for the world. So one thing is there are specialized kinds of it that allow nutrients to go into the roots of plants. So the soil fungi sustains plants directly by helping shuttle the nutrients into the roots. On a larger scale, what we now know, and we didn't know this even 10 years ago, is that networks of soil fungi actually regulate ecosystems. So, for example, if you, let's say you're in a building next to a stand of trees on a hillside. If you were to cover one of those trees with material that would prevent it from photosynthesizing, and the tree began to die, what we've seen is that the networks of mycelium in the ground will draw extra nutrients from the other trees to support that one dying tree. There's other examples of this too. There are weavings of soil fungi that are enormous. They extend for miles through the soil. And so it's almost as though the soil has a kind of intelligence or a kind of brain that helps it regulate itself. And the marvelous complexity of that in understanding the value of networks, organic networks, and how they self-regulate. It's so interesting to think of. And so therefore, when we use planting and digging techniques that penetrate the soil deeply and get rid of large amounts of it, what we're actually doing is lobotomizing the intelligence of that part of the soil that we're working on. So when you think about techniques where you, instead of digging into the soil like double digging, you actually increase the soil. You put organic matter on top of it and let it build itself up. In a way, what you're doing is you're building the intelligence of the soil. You're helping it regulate itself. So interesting to think about. Another side to all this that is not formally a part of either horticultural therapy or the wider umbrella term ecotherapy, but that has interesting implications for it, is what are called entheogens. So this means altered states through plant medicines. So one that's used an awful lot is mushrooms, and then another one is ayahuasca. So substances that come from the earth that alter our consciousness. And we know that even other animals make use of these. There are cases where, for instance, deer will chew on a certain leaf that's full of a substance like this, and then they'll get kind of high. There's photographs about this and videos on the internet running around. And so the proper use of entheogens is not to get high. It's to change your awareness in such a way that it deepens your connection to the natural world. And for those of us who have actually used them, that's exactly what happens. It's as though the conversation that we're always in with everything is brought to a higher level of consciousness. So, but the goal is not to just have peak experiences or whatever. You can do that without controlled substances. But there's a lot of research being done now too on how, for instance, psilocybin from mushrooms can create a better end-of-life experience for people who are dying. There's some research growing about how certain psychological issues and problems and wounds that people have can be aided by entheogenic therapy. It's not a running away from the emotions. It's a enhancing the ability to work with them. So there's all kinds of new research coming out about how this works. But of course, these are practices that have been known for thousands of years in indigenous societies where their use is carefully regulated by people who are experts on how all that works. So I just wanted to raise that as a possible area where ecotherapy might consider exploring. The problem is that it's to use such substances is often illegal. I think that enhanced states of consciousness in general are threatening to certain kinds of oppressive and authoritarian societies. So that's why I actually have to make the silly move of officially saying I'm not advocating the use of these, blah, blah, blah. But I think there's some very interesting research that's waiting to be done about all that and is being done in some quarters. I was a department chair at the California Institute of Integral Studies, and they now have a psychedelic medicine center set up to look into what all this is about for us. So my way of thinking about it eco-psychologically is that those sorts of substances are emissaries of a sort. They are the aspects of the natural world that reach out to us more actively in some ways and directly influence states of consciousness so that we become more aware of what our connection is. So they're not for everybody, but for some people they provide a very powerful experience. So another piece I wanted to go into a little bit came from my training as a master gardener here in California through the University of California. It's something that I've modified as a result of that training. So master gardener trainees are required to do volunteer work in gardens. And so part of what we did was we liked the idea of educating the public about gardening. And so once a month or so, we would invite people to just show up in our garden if they felt like it. It was free. And to listen to a presentation on some aspect of gardening. And so one week or 1 month, actually, we might talk about potting. Another month, we might talk about how to grow corn. We did one on composting, different aspects of backyard gardening. Pest management so that you don't have to dump chemicals into your yard and poison the groundwater and so on. So I thought it might be kind of fun to do a presentation on garden as mentor. What if we looked at the beings in our garden as teachers? Could we actually do this as a wisdom path? So I thought about the ways in which I had been changed by gardening and by encounters with plants. And then I thought about accounts from other people who had a similar experience. And what I did was I condensed these into not only a presentation, but a list of ways in which the mentors in our garden can make us wiser. So I wanted to go through that with you as an example of how this might work. So in addition to animals being our mentors, plants can be our mentors too. And so we know from horticultural therapy that plants do all kinds of wonderful things. Lift depression, release stress and anxiety, stimulate the senses, improve sleep, reduce pain, diminish mental fatigue, strengthen the immune system, lessen eating disorders, enhance recuperation from surgery, and all kinds of other things, just being around them, right? And there's lots of good research on that. But in addition, the garden can also teach us wisdom. So I want to give you some examples of how I think that works. So lesson number 1, I format these as these are the lessons that our garden plant mentors teach us. Lesson number 1, abandon perfectionism. Why? Because there is no perfect garden, right? Pests and weeds make sure of that. In the garden, you have to learn, if you're going to be a successful gardener, that many things in the garden cannot be controlled. You might plant 10 of something and nothing comes up. And then you might plant 10 more of something and 5 come up, or all of them come up. Or they all come up one season and the next, nothing, right? So you can't be attached to outcomes in the garden. There are stubborn things that won't grow, There are weed seeds that overwinter and then they come back to life unexpectedly. So nature schools control freaks. So and control really it increases our resistance to how nature works. It's insatiable, and with the desire to control always comes a sense underneath of being out of control. So the garden helps us move beyond that by showing that the universe is a messy place, and we don't need to shame ourselves by expecting ourselves to get control of any significant part of it. Because shame also is a key emotion involved in the whole project of control. It prevents us from learning to accept our imperfections. And the plants, they don't condemn us, and they don't condemn themselves. They're too busy growing. So lesson number 1, abandon perfectionism. Lesson number 2, things take time to grow. So you have to have patience. You have to trust the powers of growth in the garden. You may plant some seeds, but you don't really bring the corn up. The corn grows itself. You just provide the conditions for it. And those conditions take time. So there's this consumeristic emphasis on obtaining results immediately. You know, I'm going to enroll in Amazon Prime and get the stuff I buy in 2 days. And that works for when you're buying a radio. It doesn't work in the garden, and it doesn't work in life in general when things take time to grow. There are no deadlines in the garden, and there's no rush. So really, this is a lesson that valuable things take time. They take time creating, loving, listening, healing, right? One of the things my parents worried about when I was growing up was that I was a late speaker. And they actually consulted a doctor and who basically told them he'll talk when he's ready. And I did. I've been talking ever since. So it didn't mean no harm to be a late speaker. Things take time. So here's a self-inquiry question that comes with this lesson from the garden. How much control are we willing to give up to permit things to schedule themselves at their own pace? Right? So that's lesson 2. Things take time to grow. Wisdom takes time to grow. Lesson 3, detachment from outcomes. So like I mentioned earlier, you can go to a lot of trouble to grow things and organize things and all the rest of it. They may come up and they may not. Your efforts just may sink in the ground and disappear without a trace. That's the way it goes. So one thing this can teach us is how to initiate things and move on. How to do the best you can with somebody and move on. In therapy training, my teachers often said, you don't help anybody. You don't rescue anybody. What you do is you open a door. If they walk through, good. If they don't, good. That's not your concern. You just open the door. If they're drowning, you don't drown with them in the same swimming pool, right? So the garden can teach us that. So it gives us a sense of detachment, not indifference, not lack of care, but detachment from outcome, right? So the other thing too about this one, it kind of gets us out of the high stress role of being heroes. Heroes tend to want to save things and make things turn out a certain way and all that stuff that's part of the heroic agenda. But when we detach from outcomes, what we're doing is we're giving up some of our heroism and letting things kind of see to themselves. And that can be a tremendous relief. It can also be a cure for codependency. Codependency means that we need someone to be sick, or we need somebody to be in peril, or we need somebody, in short, whom we can save. And the garden can a little bit help cure us from that and stop being a codependent enabler. The other thing it can teach us to do is to not get too fixated on one thing that we're trying to tend and grow, and to grow a lot of things at once. So some of them might fail and some of them might succeed, but we can spread our attention to different areas instead of being mono-focused on one thing, and then when it doesn't turn out well, we're hugely disappointed. Lesson number 4, everything contributes. So the plant that you see as a weed is actually a pioneer. It's a hardy and fast grower that breaks new ground for the ecosystems to come, and it drags up all these great nutrients from deep in the ground and brings them to the surface. The technical term for that is ecological succession. So the pest who comes along and mows down a bunch of what you're growing is adding organic matter to the soil. So you don't want to let pests dominate, which is a lesson in and of itself, right? Let the pests exist, but not dominate. But while managing them, you keep in mind that every living thing has a purpose. Each has its own niche, and nothing is wasted. So in a way, a garden is a sort of organic democracy. And it's interesting to me that a lot of the founders of the United States were farmers. And they got that firsthand, right? Everything contributes. Even gophers, as much as some of us hate them, they're turning up that hard clay soil so that plant roots can get through it when the plants eventually do grow. So the garden also teaches us, because everything contributes and nothing is wasted, we shouldn't waste anything either. When there's waste that needs to be transported somewhere, that represents a breaking of an ecological cycle. In nature, there is no waste. Everything is reused. Lesson 5 from the garden, everything self-organizes. So I mentioned the fungi that stretches for miles and miles, and it keeps things going in the ecosystem, keeps things nourished. It's like the earth has its own nervous system. So likewise, in the garden, it becomes, after a while when you work with it, it has its own pattern. You realize that things like to be over here on this side, but they don't like to be over there. Or they like to be near this bunch of plants and they don't like to be near those bunch of plants. So that's something, that's a learning that you can get firsthand by actually being outside and interacting with plants. There are patterns of order in what seems to be chaotic. And the order is built in. It's emergent rather than something that you yourself impose. So I always like those photographs, and sometimes I see this when I'm out walking, where there's a pattern of concrete that's imposed on a piece of land, and then a flower chooses to grow up between the cracks. It has its own form of organization. Another lesson from the garden is that things decay and die. In our culture, we tend to hush up death and make it pretty or invisible. But in the garden, everything is dying all the time. And it makes us come right to terms with one of these great existential truths. We see it happening all the time. The garden says that some things need to go away. Some old structures are no longer useful. And a lot of them are good for compost so that they can feed new life. Right? Now, a psychological way of looking at this would be, in terms of one's own psychic energy budget, the question, the self-inquiry question, what am I prolonging and spending energy on that needs to fade away? In other words, what am I spending too much time and effort on to keep going that just needs to die? So there's a question. I had a therapy client once who had this great description of a problem with her relationships, which was why she came to see me. And she would always end up with these guys who were kind of broken down and they needed a lot of help. And so she would kind of mother them and teach them and soothe them and teach them how to dress right, and in some cases, how to look for and hold jobs and stuff like that. And I remember telling her, that sounds like a lot of effort. And she goes, yep, that's right. She sold real estate, and she said, I like my men like I like my houses, fixer-uppers. So imagine her psychic energy budget, and she got sick of it. Sometimes you learn things not so much by having insight into them, you learn them by doing them so much that you can't stand doing them anymore and you just stop, right? So, lesson 7, trusting the senses. So, in science and philosophy both, there's been a lot of emphasis on how we shouldn't trust our senses. Our senses lie to us, they don't tell us the truth about reality and things like that. Our own constructs get in the way, and granting all of that. But a distinction that's sometimes overlooked is if you have a sensory experience or some kind, and you think maybe that there's a shape in front of you that isn't really there, or you think that something is a horse and it's actually a cow, or some kind of distortion like that. The problem isn't the sense. There's nothing wrong with what you sensed in and of itself. The problem is that cognitively you misinterpreted what you saw, right? So it's not that your senses are in error, it's that you're in error for how you interpret them. So one of the things about doing work in the garden is it can speak to us through our senses and reconnect us with the world and to each other that way. And we can get a sense for what nourishes and what doesn't, what's good for us and what's bitter and should be spit out. And so science under this perspective is for verifying our interpretations of what we sense, not a replacement of our senses. So the other thing too, psychologically, is that self-distrust tends to lead to inner fragmentation and alienation and illness when the self-distrust is chronic. So oftentimes your body can tell you quite reliably what it likes and what or who you should be around and shouldn't be around. So a lesson from the garden, trust the senses. Not necessarily your interpretations of what the senses provide, though. And lesson 8, nature bats first and last. So that soil that you're playing in took millions of years of weathering and building up to prepare. So the living world that we're in, as much damage as we've done to it, it will be here a long time after we're gone, a long time after you personally are gone. That's another of the great existential truths about transience. So if our lives could be thought of as a kind of book, then nature provides the bookends. And so despite all of our anxiety and doubt and all the other things that we suffer through, loneliness and uncertainty, the forces of life and the cycles of the seasons always have us firmly in hand. Thanks.